Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Family Guy is hiding one of the most psychologically accurate portraits of a broken family ever put on television, buried underneath 20 years of cutaway gags, fart jokes, and a talking baby with a fake British accent. By tracing each Griffin family member's backstory, their repeated patterns of behavior, and the moments where the show drops the comedy and gets uncomfortably honest, we can understand how a cartoon about a man-child and his dysfunctional household became a genuine case study in childhood trauma, codependency, scapegoating, masked identity, and what happens to kids who grow up in a home where love and chaos are treated as the same thing. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Peter Griffin, the man-child and the psychology of arrested development. If you had to sit down and describe Peter Griffin to someone who has never watched Family Guy, you would probably say something like this. He is a grown man, a husband, a father of 3, and he acts like a 10-year-old boy trapped inside a 270-pound body. And that description, as simple as it sounds, is actually one of the most psychologically loaded things you could say about a person. Because Peter Griffin is not just a funny cartoon character, he is one of the clearest examples of arrested development you will ever see on screen. And when you start to pull that apart, when you start to look at why he is the way he is, the picture you get is honestly kind of sad. So let us start right at the beginning. Peter Lowenbrow Griffin was not born into a loving, stable household. He was born in Mexico, where his mother Thelma had actually traveled to try and abort him, and that attempt failed. Right from the very first moment of his life, Peter was unwanted. That is not something I am reading into. The show tells us this directly in the season 6 episode Padre de Familia. And when you think about what that means from a psychological standpoint, it sets the tone for everything that comes after. Because a child who enters the world already being rejected carries that weight with them whether they know it or not. After that, Peter was raised in Quahog by Thelma and a man named Francis Griffin. For most of his life, Peter believed Francis was his real father. It was not until the season 5 episode, Peter's Two Dads, that we learned Francis was actually his stepfather. His biological father was an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, who was completely absent from Peter's life throughout his entire childhood. Peter only met Mickey as an adult, and even then, Mickey laughed at him and rejected him at first. Peter literally had to win a drinking contest just to prove to his own biological father that they were related. Think about that for a second. The man who gave him life did not want anything to do with him, and the man who raised him, Francis, was not exactly warm either. Francis Griffin was a strict, cold, religiously extreme man who made no effort to hide his disapproval of Peter. Throughout the show, we see flashbacks of Francis being verbally harsh with Peter, putting him down, and showing very little affection. In the episode Take My Wife, Peter hits his head on a coconut and suddenly remembers being abused by his dad. And since Peter only met Mickey as an adult, the show makes it clear that this memory is about Francis. On top of that, in Peter's sister, we learn that Peter's older stepsister Karen used to physically bully him constantly. She would beat him up, humiliate him, and the family did nothing to stop it. Francis and Thelma just let it happen. Peter grew up in a home where the people who were supposed to protect him either ignored him, belittled him, or actively hurt him. Now here is where it gets interesting from a psychological point of view. When a child grows up in an environment where they feel unloved, unprotected, and constantly put down, one of the most common things that happens is something called arrested development. And no, I do not mean the TV show. What I mean is that a person's emotional growth gets stuck. They stop maturing at a certain point because the emotional tools they needed to grow up were never given to them. They never learned how to handle their feelings in a healthy way because nobody taught them. They never learned how to think before they act because nobody modeled that for them. And so what you end up with is an adult who still reacts to the world the way a child would. And that is Peter Griffin in a nutshell. He does whatever feels good in the moment without thinking about what comes next. He throws tantrums when he does not get what he wants. He makes choices that a reasonable adult would never make, and then seems completely shocked when things go wrong. He gets obsessed with whatever shiny new thing is in front of him and forgets about everything else, including his own family. These are not just character quirks that the writers threw in for laughs. These are textbook signs of someone whose emotional development got frozen somewhere around age 8 or 9. And the show actually confirms this in a very direct way. In the season 4 episode, Petarded, Brian challenges Peter to take an IQ test after Peter becomes convinced he is a genius from winning a rigged game of Trivial Pursuit. Lois had secretly swapped his question cards with ones from the preschool edition so he could win. When Peter takes the real test, his results come back with a score of around 70, which officially places him in the range of intellectual disability. A professor from the Rhode Island State Office of Mental Health tells Peter he falls just below the line. Peter even corrects the professor, saying he means just under the line, not over it, and the professor gets flustered because he just got corrected by the person he was diagnosing. That moment is played for comedy, but it actually reveals something important. Peter is not completely unaware. He has moments of sharpness. He picks up on things here and there, but his overall ability to process information, make decisions, and understand the consequences of his actions is severely limited. And when you combine that with the emotional neglect and abuse from his childhood, you get someone who is not just intellectually behind, but emotionally behind too. After Peter gets his diagnosis and petarded, he realizes that people treat him differently now. Tom Tucker does not press charges after Peter literally hits him with a car, because nobody wants to be seen punishing someone with an intellectual disability. And Peter, being Peter, immediately starts using this to his advantage. He goes around town doing whatever he wants, kicking open bathroom stalls, making inappropriate comments in public, and using his diagnosis as a free pass. He calls it playing the tard card. It is the exact kind of short-term, impulsive, consequence-free thinking you see in young children. A kid learns that crying gets them candy, so they cry every time they want candy. Peter learns that his diagnosis gets him out of trouble, so he milks it for everything it is worth. There is no long-term thinking. There is no consideration for how this affects the people around him. It is pure "what can I get right now" logic. And of course, it blows up in his face. His reckless behavior eventually leads to him accidentally catapulting hot grease at Lois's face, putting her in the hospital with severe burns. Child Protective Services steps in and takes Meg, Chris, and Stewie away from him because he is deemed mentally unfit to care for them. The kids end up in Cleveland's care, and when Peter tries to get them back, his plan is to frame Cleveland by bringing 7 prostitutes into his house. The judge sees right through it and tells Peter straight to his face that he is not just mentally challenged, he is a monster. That is the actual word the judge uses. This is the cycle Peter lives in. He does something impulsive. It hurts someone. The consequences pile up, and he either does not understand why things went wrong, or he finds someone else to blame. That cycle plays out in almost every single episode of the show, and psychologically, it is one of the most recognizable patterns you see in adults who experience childhood trauma and never got help for it. Because here is the thing about growing up the way Peter did. When a child is abused or neglected, their brain learns to focus on one thing and one thing only, which is survival in the present moment. They do not develop the ability to plan ahead or consider other people's feelings because their whole childhood was spent just trying to get through each day without getting hurt. And when that child grows into an adult, those survival instincts do not just disappear. They harden into habits. The impulsiveness, the short attention span, the inability to read a room, the need for instant gratification. These are all leftovers from a childhood where long-term thinking was a luxury Peter could not afford. You see this play out in his relationship with his kids, too. Peter bullies Meg relentlessly. He tells her to shut up. He farts on her. He insults her. He physically hurts her. And in one episode, he literally shoots her. And for the longest time, fans and even the show itself treated this as just a running joke. But in Peter's Sister, the show finally pulls back the curtain and gives us a reason. When Peter's sister Karen visits for Thanksgiving, she bullies Peter in front of his friends and family the exact same way Peter bullies Meg. And the episode makes it clear that Peter's abuse toward Meg is a direct result of the abuse he suffered from Karen. He is doing to his daughter what was done to him, not because he is evil, not because he hates Meg, but because he never dealt with what happened to him, and so the pain just keeps flowing downhill. That is one of the saddest things about Peter Griffin. He is not a villain. He is a hurt person who hurts people. He does not have the emotional vocabulary to express what he feels, so it comes out as aggression, recklessness, and cruelty. He does not have the self-awareness to recognize his patterns, so he repeats them over and over. And he does not have the tools to break the cycle, so the damage keeps spreading to the people closest to him. His drinking makes all of this worse. Peter is a heavy drinker who spends a huge chunk of his time at the Drunken Clam with his buddies Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. Alcohol is not just a hobby for Peter, it is a coping mechanism. It numbs the feelings he does not know how to process. It gives him a social circle where he feels accepted without having to be smart or mature or emotionally available. At the Clam, nobody expects anything from Peter. Nobody asks him to be a better father or a more responsible husband. He can just exist, drink, and laugh, and that is enough. For someone who spent his whole childhood being told he was not enough, that kind of acceptance is like a drug on its own. But the actual drinking makes everything so much worse. It lowers his already limited ability to think things through, which leads to even more impulsive and destructive behavior. It is a self-feeding loop. He drinks because he cannot deal with his emotions. The drinking makes his behavior worse. The worse behavior creates more problems. The problems create more emotions he cannot deal with, so he drinks more. Throughout the show, Peter has also experimented with harder substances. The show has referenced him trying cocaine, methamphetamine, and cigarettes at various points. None of this is the behavior of a man who has a grip on his life. This is the behavior of someone desperately trying to feel something other than what they normally feel, or trying to feel nothing at all. And yet, for all of this, there are moments scattered throughout the show where you see a different Peter. In Death Lives, Death takes Peter through his memories and reminds him why he fell in love with Lois, and Peter comes back with genuine appreciation for his wife. In Road to Rupert, Peter privately tells Meg that he will mistreat her in front of the family, but behind closed doors, he will be her friend. In Peter's Daughter, when Meg is in danger, Peter shows real fear and concern for her safety. These moments are small, and they never last, but they are there. They show us that somewhere underneath the impulsiveness, the cruelty, and the childish behavior, there is a person who does feel love. He just has absolutely no idea how to show it in a consistent, healthy way. That is what makes Peter Griffin such a fascinating case from a psychological standpoint. He is not a bad person pretending to be good, and he is not a good person who occasionally slips up. He is a deeply damaged man who never got the help he needed, living out the consequences of that every single day. His childhood was defined by rejection, abuse, and neglect. His adult life is defined by impulsiveness, emotional outbursts, and an inability to grow. He is stuck. And the worst part is, he does not even know he is stuck. He thinks this is just how life works. He thinks this is normal. And in a way, that might be the most heartbreaking thing about Peter Griffin. Not the stupid jokes, not the reckless stunts, not even the cruelty toward Meg. The most heartbreaking thing is that Peter genuinely believes he is doing fine. He has no frame of reference for what a healthy life looks like because he has never seen one. His stepfather was cold and abusive. His mother was neglectful. His biological father was absent. His sister tormented him. Nobody ever sat Peter down and showed him what it looks like to be a present, caring, emotionally aware adult. So he just wings it. Every single day, he wakes up and stumbles through life using the only tools he was ever given, which are basically none at all. And the people around him pay the price for that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Peter is only one half of the equation. Because for every person like Peter who cannot seem to grow up, there is usually someone standing right next to them, holding everything together, cleaning up every mess, and slowly losing themselves in the process. And in the Griffin household, that person is Lois. Section 2. Lois Griffin, the enabler who holds it all together and falls apart doing it. On the surface, Lois Griffin looks like the only functional person in the house. She cooks, she cleans, she raises 3 kids, manages the finances, teaches piano on the side, and somehow keeps a roof over the family's head despite the fact that her husband blows money on things like custom helicopters he cannot afford. In almost every episode, especially in the earlier seasons, Lois is the one pulling the family back from the edge. She is the voice of reason. She is the one saying, "Peter, do not do that," even though Peter always does it anyway. She is the glue. And for a long time, that is all most viewers saw when they looked at Lois Griffin. But if a psychologist were sitting in the room watching this family, they would see something very different. They would not see a strong, capable woman holding it together. They would see someone who has spent years bending herself around the chaos of another person, absorbing damage, making excuses, and quietly losing pieces of who she is along the way. In psychological terms, Lois Griffin is a textbook enabler. And that role did not start when she married Peter. It started a long time before that. Lois was born into the Pewtersmith family, one of the wealthiest families in the show's world. Her father, Carter Pewtersmith, is a billionaire. She grew up in a mansion, surrounded by money, status, and every material comfort you could imagine. But money does not mean love, and Carter is not a warm man. Throughout the series, we learn that Carter was emotionally cold and distant with Lois growing up. In one of the more disturbing details, the show reveals that when Lois was kidnapped as a child, Carter refused to pay the ransom. He hung up the phone while his own daughter was telling him that her captors would kill her if he did not pay. He made no effort to rescue her. He just told himself she would be fine. That one detail tells you everything you need to know about Lois's childhood. She grew up in a home where she had every material thing a kid could want, but the emotional support was just not there. Her father treated her like an afterthought. He never even took her to the zoo, despite how much she wanted him to. When Lois had a nanny who genuinely cared about her, Carter had that nanny fired, and Lois never found out why until the nanny's funeral years later. Her mother, Barbara, is not shown to be much better when it comes to standing up for Lois or providing real emotional closeness. And to make things even more complicated, Lois has an older brother named Patrick who was sent to a mental institution after becoming a serial killer. That is the kind of family she comes from. Wealth on the outside, complete dysfunction on the inside. When children grow up in homes like that, where the parent is emotionally unavailable or outright neglectful, they often develop a pattern that sticks with them for life. They learn that love has to be earned. They learn that their job is to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to not make waves. They learn to take care of other people's emotional needs while ignoring their own, because nobody ever showed them that their own feelings mattered. They become hyper-aware of other people's moods, always scanning the room, always adjusting their behavior to keep things calm. And the worst part is, they do not realize they are doing it. It just becomes second nature, like breathing. That pattern, once it gets locked in during childhood, tends to repeat itself in every major relationship that person has going forward. They gravitate toward people who need fixing, people who need saving, people who take up all the space in the room, because that is the only dynamic that feels familiar. Which brings us to Peter. Lois met Peter when he was working as a towel boy for her aunt. He was from a completely different world. No money, no education, no social standing. Her father hated him from the moment they met. Carter tried everything to keep them apart, including knocking Peter unconscious and shipping him to the middle of the ocean. He even offered Peter $10 million to stay away from Lois, but Peter turned it down. And Lois was so moved by this that she chose him. They eloped at Fenway Park while Lois was already pregnant with Meg. Now, on the surface, this looks like a love story. A rich girl chooses a poor but loyal man over her controlling father's wishes. But when you look at it through a psychological lens, something else becomes clear. Lois did not just choose Peter because she loved him. She chose a man who was the exact opposite of her father in almost every way. Carter is cold, calculating, and emotionally distant. Peter is loud, emotional, and fully present, even if that presence often takes the form of doing something incredibly stupid. For someone who grew up starving for emotional warmth, Peter's childlike openness would have felt like oxygen. He was messy and impulsive and all over the place, but he was there. He showed up. He felt things. And for Lois, that was enough. It was more than she had ever gotten at home. But here is the problem. When someone chooses a partner based on what was missing from their childhood, rather than what is actually good for them, they often end up in a relationship where they recreate the same dynamic they grew up with, just wearing a different mask. Lois did not marry her father. She married someone who needed her the way a child needs a parent. And she slipped right into the role of caretaker because that is the only role she has ever known. She takes care of Peter. She takes care of the kids. She takes care of the house. She takes care of everything. And in return, she gets almost nothing. Think about what Lois puts up with on a daily basis. Peter has gotten her seriously injured multiple times. In Petarded, his reckless behavior with hot grease puts her in the hospital with severe burns so bad that she ends up in a full body cast. He has forgotten their anniversary and ditched her on special occasions to hang out with his friends at the Drunken Clam. He has publicly humiliated her. He has destroyed their property. He has put the family in financial ruin over and over again by spending money they do not have. He once bought a helicopter they could not afford and crashed it into their neighbor Joe's yard. He has been physically violent with their daughter Meg. He has cheated on her and she has cheated on him. Their marriage has been through more than most marriages could survive in a dozen lifetimes. And through all of it, Lois stays. A psychologist would look at this and ask a very simple question. Why? And the answer is not just because she loves him, although she does. The answer is that Lois has been trained, since she was a little girl in that Pewterschmidt mansion, to believe that her value comes from what she does for other people. Her worth is tied to her usefulness. If she is needed, she matters. If she is holding things together, she has a purpose. And the moment she stops doing that, the moment she steps away from the caretaker role, she does not know who she is anymore. You can actually see this play out in the show. In the Season 4 episode, Breaking Out is Hard to Do, Lois discovers shoplifting. It starts small. She is short on money at the grocery store and steals a ham instead of putting it back. But then she keeps doing it. The thrill of it hooks her. She starts stealing more and more, bigger and bigger items, until it spirals completely out of control and she ends up sentenced to 3 years in prison. Peter breaks her out, and the whole family goes on the run. On the surface, this is a comedy episode, but underneath the jokes, it is showing us something real about Lois. She is a woman who spends every single day giving and giving and giving, taking care of everyone else, holding the family together, putting her own wants last. And the one time she does something purely for herself, something that gives her a rush and makes her feel alive, it is literally a crime. She cannot even pursue her own pleasure without it being destructive. That is not a coincidence. That is a woman who has completely lost touch with her own needs, and the only way she knows how to feel anything for herself is through extreme, self-sabotaging behavior. And this is not the only time we see it. The show has shown us over the years that Lois has some serious issues bubbling under the surface. She has shown signs of addiction, not just with the shoplifting, but with attention, with control, with needing to feel desired. In later seasons, she is shown being unfaithful to Peter on multiple occasions. She becomes more controlling, more manipulative, more willing to put her own wants above her family's well-being. A lot of fans blame this on bad writing and character changes in the later seasons, and there is probably some truth to that. But there is also a psychological reality underneath it. People who spend years and years suppressing their own needs to take care of someone else do not just stay stable forever. Eventually, something cracks, the resentment builds, the unmet needs pile up, and it all starts leaking out in ugly, unpredictable ways. What makes Lois especially interesting is that she is not just a passive victim in this family. She is also part of the problem. A true enabler does not just tolerate bad behavior, they make it possible for that behavior to continue. Every time Peter does something reckless and Lois cleans up the mess without any real consequences, she is teaching him that there are no consequences. Every time he hurts someone and she smooths it over, she is giving him permission to do it again. She is not doing this on purpose, she is doing it because it is all she knows, but the effect is the same. And nowhere is this more visible than in how she treats Meg. Lois is not the worst offender when it comes to Meg's abuse. That title belongs to Peter. But Lois is the one who could stop it and chooses not to. She rarely defends Meg. She sometimes joins in on the insults. In the episode Steroids, when Meg is upset about not being invited to a party, Lois hands her a book by an author who killed herself and a bottle of sleeping pills, and says she is going to look the other way, and whatever happens, happens. Whether that moment is meant to be taken literally or as a dark joke, it tells us that Lois has reached a point where she cannot even muster the energy to comfort her own daughter in a meaningful way. She is so drained, so hollowed out by years of caretaking and enabling, that she has nothing left to give the child who needs her the most. This is one of the most painful things about the enabler role. It does not just hurt the person playing it, it hurts everyone around them, especially the children. Lois pours everything she has into managing Peter. She pours whatever is left into keeping the house running. And by the time she gets to her kids, she is running on empty. Meg gets the scraps. Chris gets slightly more attention, but not much real guidance. And Stewie, the youngest, is left largely to his own devices, building time machines, and having full conversations with the family dog, because his parents are too absorbed in their own cycle to notice what is happening right in front of them. And here is the thing that a psychologist would point out about Lois that most people miss. She had an out. She always had an out. Her family is worth billions. She could have left Peter at any point and gone back to the Peter Schmidt fortune. She would have had every resource available to her and her children. But she stays. And she stays not because she is trapped financially, like many people in similar situations are. She stays because leaving would mean admitting that the life she built, the identity she created as the woman who holds everything together, was not working. It would mean facing the fact that all those years of sacrifice and caretaking did not fix Peter, did not create a healthy family, and did not give her the love and appreciation she was looking for. For someone whose entire sense of self is built around being needed, that kind of admission feels like dying. So she stays, and the cycle keeps going. Lois Griffin walked out of one emotionally cold household and straight into another kind of chaos. She traded a father who would not pay her ransom for a husband who put her in the hospital. She traded being ignored for being taken for granted. And the saddest part is, she probably does not even see the connection. She thinks she chose something different. She thinks her life with Peter is the opposite of her life with Carter. But a psychologist would see it in 5 minutes. The setting changed, the costumes changed, but the role stayed exactly the same. Lois is still the girl in the big house, taking care of everyone else, hoping that if she just does enough, someone will finally take care of her back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But if Lois is the person who absorbs the chaos to keep the family running, there is someone in the Griffin house who absorbs something far worse. Someone who does not get the credit Lois gets, does not get the "at least she tries" pass, and does not even get the basic dignity of being treated like a full human being. And that person is Meg. Section 3. Meg Griffin. The family scapegoat and what that does to a person. There is no character on television who has been treated as badly, for as long, and with as little consequence as Meg Griffin. Every family in fiction has its underdog. Every sitcom has someone who catches more heat than the rest. But what happens to Meg goes far beyond a running joke. What we see play out across hundreds of episodes of Family Guy is a textbook case of something that psychologists call scapegoating, and it is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a person inside of a family. To understand what scapegoating actually is, you do not need a textbook. You just need to watch what happens every time the Griffins are in a room together. Whenever something goes wrong, whenever tension builds, whenever someone in the family feels bad about themselves, the response is always the same. They turn to Meg. They insult her. They dismiss her. They blame her. They make her the target so that nobody else has to sit with their own discomfort. And then, once Meg has absorbed all of that negativity, everyone else feels better and moves on with their day. Meg is left to deal with the damage alone. Peter is the worst offender by a wide margin. His treatment of Meg goes beyond neglect and into something that, if it happened in the real world, would be considered abuse without any question. He tells her to shut up constantly. It has become one of his most well-known lines in the entire show. He farts on her. He insults her appearance. He has been physically violent with her on multiple occasions, including an episode where he literally shoots her. In Untitled Griffin Family History, when the family is hiding during a break-in, Meg runs out of her room to check what is happening, and Peter immediately turns on her. In 8 Simple Rules for Buying My Teenage Daughter, Peter sells Meg to Neil Goldman just to settle his pharmacy bill. He did not even hesitate. His own daughter, traded away like she meant nothing, because to Peter, in that moment, she did not. And the abuse is not limited to Peter. Chris piles on whenever the rest of the family does. In Seahorse Seashell Party, he kicks Meg for speaking up. Lois, as we covered earlier, rarely steps in to defend Meg and sometimes makes things worse. In Steroids, when Meg is upset about not being invited to a party, Lois gives her a book by Sylvia Plath, an author who took her own life, and a bottle of sleeping pills, and says she is going to look the other way, and whatever happens, happens. Even if that is written as a dark joke, The message it sends to Meg is crystal clear. Your pain is not worth my time. Figure it out yourself. I do not care how. And in that same episode, we see what Lois packs for Meg's school lunch. Not real food. Crusts from Chris's sandwich, an orange peel, and a photograph of Lois eating a turkey leg, as if to taunt her. That is not forgetfulness. That is cruelty. In Peter's Daughter, after Meg tells Lois she loves her, Lois says nothing back. Just silence. No response at all. And in Breaking Out is Hard to Do, when Lois is dangling over a ledge and Joe tells her to pretend he is her child so she will hold on tighter, Lois starts to think of Meg, and her grip loosens. She has to redirect her thoughts away from Meg just to keep holding on. The show plays it as a quick gag, but think about what that says. Even in a life or death moment, thinking about Meg makes Lois want to let go. Even the kids at school participate. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl at James Woods Regional High School, has made Meg's life miserable for years. The bullying has been so severe and so constant that in Steroids, Meg actually shows Connie the scars on her arm. Real, visible scars. And she tells Connie exactly which acts of cruelty caused which scar. Each one is tied to a specific moment of humiliation that hurt Meg badly enough to make her harm herself. This is not played for laughs. This is one of the most disturbing moments in the entire series, because it shows us what years of relentless cruelty have actually done to this girl. And that is just the beginning. In Sibling Rivalry, Meg openly says that she does not eat to solve her problems, she cuts herself. She says this in front of her family. Nobody reacts. Nobody checks on her. The conversation just moves on. In Barely Legal, Meg threatens to kill herself when no one at school will go to prom with her. Again, this gets brushed off by the people around her. In the kiss scene Around the World, she makes similar threats. The pattern is the same every time. Meg signals that she is in real pain, and the people who should care about her either ignore it or treat it as an annoyance. From a psychological standpoint, this is exactly what happens to scapegoated children in real families. The scapegoat is not chosen because they did something wrong. They are chosen because the family needs someone to carry the weight of its own problems. In a healthy family, when tension rises, people talk about it, they work through it. In a family like the Griffins, nobody has those skills. Peter cannot process his emotions. Lois is too busy managing Peter to deal with her own feelings, let alone anyone else's. Chris follows whatever the dominant energy in the room is, and Stewie is off in his own world. So when the pressure builds and there is nowhere for it to go, it lands on Meg. She becomes the release valve for the entire household. The show actually acknowledges this in one of its most controversial episodes. In Seahorse Seashell Party, a hurricane traps the Griffins inside their home. Without anywhere to go and nothing to distract them, they start taking their frustrations out on Meg as usual. But this time, Meg fights back. She has finally had enough. She turns on each member of the family, one by one, and tells them exactly what she thinks of them. She starts with Chris, calling him out for never once taking her side against their parents. Then she goes after Lois. She brings up Lois's shoplifting, her criminal history, and the fact that she is nowhere near the good mother she pretends to be. Meg tells Lois that when she turns 18, she might never see any of them again. Lois breaks down in tears. Then Meg turns to Peter. She calls him a fat, lazy, abusive father who drinks too much and has nothing to show for his life. She tells him that his only real accomplishments are his kids, and they are a disaster. Peter does not even realize he is being insulted at first. When it finally hits him, he runs upstairs crying. And here is what happens next, and this is the part that matters more than anything else. With Meg no longer absorbing the family's problems, they all turn on each other. Lois starts attacking Peter. Peter attacks back. Chris joins in. Within minutes, the entire family is at each other's throats, screaming and crying. The house falls apart. It is total chaos. Meg watches this happen, and after talking it through with Brian, she comes to a conclusion. She says to Brian, "Do you think it is possible that this family cannot survive without some sort of lightning rod to absorb all the dysfunction?" And Brian, to his credit, calls what she is doing incredibly noble and mature. He tells her she might be the strongest person in the house. But what Meg does next is not strength. It is something much sadder than that. She goes back to her family, apologizes for standing up for herself, takes the blame for the fight, and allows everyone to pile their problems back onto her. She volunteers to be the punching bag again. And just like that, the family goes back to normal. This is one of the most psychologically real things Family Guy has ever done, even though most fans hated the ending. Because what Meg does in that moment is exactly what real scapegoated children do in real families. They eventually realize that the family does not work without someone to blame, and rather than watch the whole thing collapse, they sacrifice themselves to keep it going. They absorb the pain so nobody else has to. They tell themselves it is their job. They convince themselves that this is how they contribute, and in doing so, they lose themselves completely. A psychologist would look at what Meg says in that episode and feel their heart sink, because Meg is not making a heroic choice, she is making a survival choice. She has been conditioned, through years and years of abuse, to believe that her only value to this family is as a target. When she stood up for herself, the family fell apart. So in her mind, the lesson is clear. If she wants to keep her family, she has to keep suffering. The love she gets, the scraps of acceptance she receives, are all tied to her willingness to take the hits. The moment she stops taking them, she loses everything. That kind of thinking does not come from nowhere. It is built over years of consistent treatment. When every single person in your life treats you like you do not matter, at some point, you start to believe them. When your father sells you for a pharmacy bill, and your mother hands you sleeping pills when you are upset, and your brother kicks you for speaking, and the kids at school humiliate you so badly that you carry the scars on your body, you do not walk away from that with a healthy sense of who you are. You walk away believing that you deserve it. You walk away believing that this is normal. And that belief becomes the foundation of every relationship you have after that. In real life, children who are scapegoated often grow up to be adults who struggle with depression, low self-worth, and difficulty trusting others. They tend to end up in relationships where they are mistreated because that is the only kind of love that feels familiar to them. They have trouble setting boundaries because they were never allowed to have any, and many of them end up completely cutting off their families as adults because at some point they realize that the family they have been holding together does not actually care about them at all. Meg has shown signs of nearly all of these things. She has dated criminals. In Dial Meg for Murder, she is so desperate for any form of connection that she gets involved with an inmate, gets sent to prison herself, and comes back as a completely different person. She terrorizes her family. She beats Peter up so badly that she knocks his teeth out. She robs Mort's pharmacy while saying out loud that nobody cares about her. For that brief stretch, she flips the power dynamic completely. The family is suddenly afraid of her, walking on eggshells the same way she has walked on eggshells around them for years. But even that does not last. The episode ends and things go back to normal. Meg goes back to being the target, because that is her role. That is what this family needs her to be. The rebellion was temporary. The conditioning runs too deep. And here is maybe the most painful part of all. Meg is, according to multiple moments across the show, the most decent member of the Griffin family. She is the most moral. She is the most self-aware. She is the one who actually thinks about other people's feelings. Brian even says this to her face in Seahorse Seashell Party, calling her the strongest person in the house. And yet, all of that goodness, all of that emotional awareness gets used against her. The fact that she cares is the reason she keeps going back. The fact that she has a conscience is the reason she apologizes when she has nothing to apologize for. Her best qualities are the exact things that keep her trapped. Scapegoating does not just destroy the person at the center of it, it warps the entire family. It teaches everyone in the house that there is always someone below them, someone they can step on when things get hard. It teaches the other children that love is earned by not being the weak one. It teaches the parents that they never have to look at themselves because there is always someone else to blame. And it teaches the scapegoat that love and pain are the same thing. Meg Griffin is a cartoon character, but the pattern she lives in is something millions of real people have experienced. the kid who gets picked on at home and has nowhere to turn, the teenager who hurts themselves because the pain on the outside feels easier to manage than the pain on the inside, the young adult who keeps going back to a family that treats them like garbage because at least it is familiar, and familiar feels safer than alone. If a psychologist were watching the Griffin family, Meg would be the person they would be most worried about. Not because she is the loudest or the most dramatic, but because she is the quietest. She is the one absorbing everything. She is the one who has stopped expecting things to get better. And in psychology, when someone stops fighting back, that is not peace. That is something much more concerning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Meg is not the only Griffin child who has been quietly shaped by this household. There is another kid in this family who gets overlooked in almost every conversation. Someone who carries his own kind of weight and rarely gets credit for it. And that is Chris. Section 4. Chris Griffin, the overlooked middle child and the weight of a learning disability. Nobody talks about Chris Griffin. Not the fans, not the other characters on the show, and definitely not his parents. In a family full of loud, attention-grabbing personalities, Chris is the one who fades into the background. Peter gets attention because he is a walking disaster. Lois gets attention because she is constantly putting out fires. Meg gets attention, even if it is the worst kind. Stewie gets attention because he is a genius baby plotting world domination. Brian gets attention because he is a talking dog who thinks he is smarter than everyone else. And then there is Chris, standing in the middle of all of it. Not loud enough to demand anything, not broken enough for anyone to worry about. Just there, just existing. And from a psychological standpoint, that kind of invisibility can do more damage than most people realize. Chris is the middle child of the Griffin family. He is 13 when the show begins and is voiced by Seth Green. He is overweight, not very bright by the show's standards, and spends most of his time doing whatever the rest of the family tells him to do. He attends James Woods Regional High School, where he regularly gets some of the worst grades in his class. In the episode No Chris Left Behind, he is actually expelled from school because he has the lowest standardized test scores in the entire building. The principal, forced to make a choice about how to save the school's funding, picks Chris as the student to remove. Not because Chris caused trouble, not because he was a behavior problem, but because, on paper, he was the weakest link, the one nobody would fight to keep. And that moment says everything about Chris's place in the world. He is expendable. He is the person people let go of first. And he has been treated that way his entire life. Now, there is an important thing to understand about Chris before we go further. The show never gives him a clear, specific diagnosis. He is not labeled the way Peter is labeled in Petarded. But the evidence across the series points to someone who has a real learning disability. He struggles with reading. He struggles with basic math. In one episode, he says that when he sticks an army man's bayonet up his nose, it tickles his brain. And after doing it, he says he cannot do math anymore. That is played as a joke, but the underlying point is real. Chris has consistent, persistent trouble with things that other kids his age can handle. And nobody in his family has ever taken the time to figure out why, or get him the help he might need. In When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Chris is so desperate to improve his math grades that he is willing to convert to an entirely different religion because he believes it will make him smarter. That is not something a kid does because he is lazy. That is something a kid does when he is so far behind that he will try anything, no matter how extreme, to catch up. In If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, we learn that Chris is pulling C- to D grades. That is not a kid who is slacking off. That is a kid who is trying and failing. There is a big difference between a student who does not care and a student who cannot keep up no matter how hard they try. And Chris falls into the second group. He studies. In No Chris Left Behind, we see him at the breakfast table studying for an exam. Brian notices that the history textbook Chris is using is hopelessly out of date. The school cannot afford new ones, so Chris is doing his best with the wrong tools in an underfunded school, with parents who are not paying close enough attention to notice. He is set up to fail from every direction, and when he does fail, The system punishes him for it instead of asking what went wrong. After being expelled, Chris briefly enrolls in a private academy thanks to his wealthy grandfather Carter Pewterschmidt. But the rich kids there shun him. He does not fit in. He is not one of them. He comes from a different world and everyone can tell. Eventually, Chris asks Carter to help him get back into his old school, because even a place that kicked him out felt more like home than a place where nobody wanted him around. Think about that for a second. A teenager chose to go back to the school that expelled him because it was less painful than being the outsider somewhere new. That is not a kid making a casual decision. That is a kid whose sense of belonging is so damaged that even rejection from a familiar place feels safer than acceptance he cannot trust. But here is what makes Chris different from what people expect. He is not just the dumb kid. He is a genuinely talented artist. This shows up in the very first season of the series. In The Sun Also Draws, Chris is in the Youth Scouts, which he hates. He does not want to be there. What he wants to do is draw. But he is terrified to tell his father, because Peter signed him up for Scouts and Chris is afraid of letting Peter down. He is afraid that his real interests, the things he actually cares about, are not good enough for his dad. Eventually, Chris gets kicked out of the Scouts anyway, after he runs over the troop leader during a soapbox derby. Peter, determined to get Chris back in, drags the whole family to the Scout headquarters in New York. During the trip, Chris finally tells Peter the truth. He says, "Dad, the Scouts are no fun. I just want to draw." And Peter's first response? He stands up and says they are never to speak of this again. Peter literally refuses to hear what his son is telling him. Chris's actual passion, the thing that makes him come alive, gets shut down in a single sentence. It takes a vision quest in the wilderness, after Peter is delirious from hunger, for him to finally see Chris's drawings and recognize that his son has real talent. Peter says he never knew anyone in the family had any talent. It is a nice moment, but think about what it took to get there. Peter had to be starving, hallucinating, and talking to imaginary trees before he could sit still long enough to actually look at what his son had created. That is how hard it is for Chris to get his father's attention. The bar is not high. The bar is buried underground, and Chris still has to fight to reach it. This artistic ability comes up again in A Picture is Worth $1,000. Chris paints an abstract picture for Peter's birthday. Peter does not recognize its value and uses it to cover the broken window in his car. But an art dealer from New York sees the painting and calls it a masterpiece. He wants to take Chris to the city and launch his career. For one brief, shining moment, Chris has a path forward. Someone sees him. Someone recognizes what he can do. But the opportunity falls apart, and Chris ends up back in Quahog, back in his regular life, back to being invisible. This is the tragedy of Chris Griffin. He has something real inside of him, a genuine gift, but nobody in his immediate world takes it seriously enough to help him develop it. Peter is too wrapped up in his own chaos. Lois is too busy managing Peter. The school system has written him off because of his test scores, and Chris himself does not have the confidence or the support to push forward on his own. So the talent just sits there, unused, while Chris keeps trying to be the version of himself that his family expects, which is basically a quieter, less troublesome version of his dad. What is interesting is that when Chris is around the right people, he actually lights up. His friendship with Carl, the guy who works at the movie store, is one of the few relationships in the show where Chris gets treated like a real person. When Chris talks about movies with Carl, he is surprisingly sharp. He has opinions. He can hold the conversation. He shows a side of himself that his family almost never gets to see, because at home, he has learned to keep that side hidden. The show also reveals that Chris has other unexpected abilities. He can speak Cockney English after the family moves to London in Patriot games, picking it up faster than anyone else. He has given detailed, well-spoken lectures about serious topics when the moment calls for it. The intelligence is in there. It just does not come out in the ways that schools and standardized tests are set up to measure. And speaking of his dad, the relationship between Chris and Peter is one of the most psychologically interesting in the whole show, even though it rarely gets talked about. Chris idolizes Peter. He wants Peter's approval more than almost anything. In The Sun Also Draws and If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, we see that Chris is genuinely afraid that he does not live up to his father's expectations. They compete, but Chris almost always loses. And in He's Too Sexy for His Fat, when Peter gets liposuction and becomes physically fit, Chris is visibly crushed. Suddenly, his father is the thin, attractive version of what Chris has always been mocked for being, and it makes Chris feel even worse about himself. Chris has always been self-conscious about his weight. He was called an elephant child when he was born. That kind of label, even as a throwaway joke, sticks. And when your own father, who was overweight too and was supposed to be on your side, suddenly becomes everything you are not, the message is devastating. It says that even the person most like you does not want to be like you. It says that what you are is something to escape from. A psychologist looking at Chris would see a kid caught in a very specific trap. He is smart enough to know that he is not doing well, but he does not have the tools or the support to change it. He can feel the gap between where he is and where other people expect him to be, and that gap eats at him constantly. He compensates by being agreeable, by going along with whatever the family is doing, by not making waves. He joins in when the family picks on Meg, because that is the current of the household, and swimming against it would mean drawing attention to himself. And drawing attention to himself means risking the same kind of rejection he has already experienced at school, with the scouts, and with the rich kids at the private academy. Even his brief relationship with Connie D'Amico and steroids follows this pattern. The most popular girl in school only dates Chris because she has run out of popular boys and wants a project. She does not actually see him. She sees raw material she can shape into something more acceptable. And even though Chris and Connie end up having a genuine connection for a short time, the whole thing is built on the idea that Chris, as he is not enough. He has to be changed, polished, made into someone else before he is worth being around. In psychology, there is a pattern where kids who feel invisible at home start to believe that they do not deserve to be seen. They shrink themselves. They take up less space. They stop asking for things because they have learned that asking leads to disappointment. They become the easy child, the one nobody worries about, not because they are actually fine, but because they have gotten very good at looking fine. And that is Chris in a nutshell. He is the kid the family never has to think about. He does not cause the kind of drama Peter causes. He does not generate the kind of worry Meg generates. He is not scheming like Stewie or lecturing like Brian. He is just there, and everyone assumes that just being there means he is okay. But he is not okay. He is a teenager with a learning disability that nobody has properly addressed, an artistic talent that nobody has properly supported, a weight issue that gets used as a punchline by the people who are supposed to love him, and a father who needed to be on the edge of starvation before he could notice his son's gifts. Chris Griffin is drowning in plain sight, and nobody in that house can see it because they are all too busy drowning in their own problems. The irony is that Chris might be the most salvageable person in the Griffin family. He does not have Peter's deep-rooted refusal to grow up. He does not have Lois's addiction to the caretaker role. He does not have Meg's years of severe psychological damage. He has a real skill, a real sensitivity, and a real desire to connect with the people around him. All he needs is someone to pay attention, someone to look at his drawings and say, "This matters. You matter. Let us figure this out together." But in the Griffin household, that kind of attention is the one thing nobody has to spare. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if Chris is the family member who gets overlooked entirely, the one who slips through every crack in the system without anyone stopping to catch him, there is another Griffin who gets plenty of attention but has spent his whole life making sure nobody sees the real version of him. A baby who builds weapons, speaks with an accent nobody in his family uses, and hides behind a personality so layered that even he might not know what is underneath it anymore. That is Stewie. Section 5. Stewie Griffin. Identity, Sexuality, and the Mask We Build to Survive. Stewie Griffin is one of the strangest characters on television. A one-year-old baby who can speak in full sentences, build time machines, construct fighter jets in his bedroom, and plot the overthrow of entire governments. On paper, none of it makes any sense. But what makes Stewie more than just a joke? What makes him one of the most psychologically fascinating characters in the history of animated television is not the gadgets or the evil plans. It is the fact that almost everything about him is a performance. And deep down, even Stewie knows it. When Family Guy first started in 1999, Stewie had two goals: kill his mother Lois and take over the world. Every episode in the early seasons had some version of this. He would build a weapon, hatch a scheme, try to destroy Lois, and fail. It was a running gag. A baby with the mind of a Bond villain, trapped in a house full of people who mostly could not even understand what he was saying. The humor came from the gap between who Stewie thought he was, a brilliant, dangerous mastermind, and what he actually was, a toddler in overalls holding a teddy bear named Rupert. His grudge against Lois seemed to stem from spending 9 months in what he called her ovarian Bastille, and his schemes ranged from building ray guns to constructing elaborate traps to simply trying to shoot her. He built fighter jets, mind control devices, weather machines, teleportation pods, and an entire arsenal of weapons that would make most governments jealous. All from his bedroom, all before his 2nd birthday. But something shifted as the show went on. The world domination plots started fading. The murder attempts on Lois became less frequent, and a new version of Stewie started to appear. One that was less interested in taking over the world and more concerned with something much harder: figuring out who he actually is. The turning point came in the 2-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie. In these episodes, Stewie finally succeeds in killing Lois. He shoots her on a cruise ship. She falls into the ocean. A year passes. Stewie takes over the world. He gains control of the entire government. He has everything he ever said he wanted. And then Lois comes back. She survived. The two of them fight, and Peter ends up killing Stewie. But then we learn that none of it was real. The entire thing was a computer simulation that Stewie had been running to test what would happen if he went through with his plans. And the result told him something he was not ready to hear. If he goes down that path, he loses. He dies. It ends badly. After that, Stewie quietly shelves the world domination plans. He stops trying to kill Lois, at least with any real effort. And the show starts exploring a completely different side of him: his identity, his loneliness, and his sexuality. For years, Family Guy dropped hints. Stewie would make comments about attractive men. He would have fantasies involving his teddy bear Rupert that went beyond what a child would typically have with a stuffed animal. He would obsess over male celebrities. He would make references to musical theater, to fashion, to culture, in ways that were clearly coded as gay. In a Thanksgiving episode, he almost came out to his family because he felt comfortable enough to share the truth, but he was cut off mid-sentence before he could finish. In the direct-to-video movie, Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, a future version of Stewie was shown living as a gay man. Fans noticed, critics noticed. Seth MacFarlane himself said in 2009 that he considered the character to have gone through a transformation from a Bond villain to a closeted homosexual. The show even developed a full script for an episode where Stewie would officially come out, driven by the harassment he was facing from other kids at school. But the episode was scrapped because the showrunners wanted to keep his identity open-ended. For years, it stayed as a running joke, a wink to the audience, something everyone could see, but nobody in the show would say out loud. And then came Send in Stewie, Please. This episode, the 300th of the series, aired in season 16. It takes place almost entirely in one room. Stewie has been sent to see a child psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, voiced by Sir Ian McKellen, after pushing a boy named Tyler down the stairs at school. And over the course of 22 minutes, Stewie opens up in ways we have never seen before. He talks about his feelings. He talks about his fears. He talks about why he pushed that boy. And then he reveals the biggest secret of his life. His accent is fake. Stewie tells Dr. Pritchfield that everything about him is what he calls a carefully constructed persona designed to keep people at arm's length. The British accent, the one he has had since the very first episode, is not real. He says, in his actual voice, which sounds like a normal American kid, the accent is nothing more than an affectation, a coat of armor to get me through the day. Just an image I cultivated so I could feel special. Let that sink in for a second. For 16 seasons, hundreds of episodes, And over a decade of real-world time, the voice we have heard coming out of Stewie Griffin was never who he really was. It was a mask, a shield, a way to make himself feel different and superior because the alternative, being ordinary, being vulnerable, being just another kid, was too frightening to face. A psychologist would recognize this immediately. Children who feel unsafe, who feel unseen, or who feel that they are fundamentally different from the people around them will often build a version of themselves that they present to the world. It is not lying exactly. It is survival. They create a character that feels stronger, smarter, more in control than they actually are, and they hide behind that character because the real version of themselves feels too exposed. Stewie did not just adopt an accent. He built an entire identity. The genius, the villain, the one who does not need anyone, the one who is better than everyone. All of it was armor. All of it was protection. And the one person he was protecting himself from the most was himself. Because here's what else comes out in that therapy session. Stewie is not gay, and he is not straight. He is, in the words of the show's own writers, sexually fluid. His awareness of his own sexuality is uncertain, unclear, still forming. He knows there is something different about him. He can feel it, but he is not ready to name it. He is not ready to claim it. And instead of sitting with that discomfort the way a healthy person might, he buries it under layers and layers of performance. The world domination plots, the genius inventions, the accent, the attitude, all of it serves the same purpose. It keeps people from getting close enough to see the real Stewie. Because the real Stewie is scared. The real Stewie does not know who he is. And admitting that, even to himself, feels like the most dangerous thing in the world. Writer Gary Janetti, who wrote the episode, explained it clearly. He said that Stewie's uncertainty about his sexuality gives him a vulnerability, and that vulnerability is something that needs to stay as it is. It is not about giving Stewie a label. It is about showing a character who is in the middle of figuring himself out and is terrified of what he might find. And what does Stewie do at the end of that therapy session? The one time in his life when someone actually gets through to him, when someone sees past the armor and touches something real, he lets Dr. Pritchfield die. The therapist has a heart condition and asks Stewie to hand him his medication. Stewie refuses. He watches the man who helped him have the most honest conversation of his life struggle and fade. Because Stewie cannot allow anyone to walk around knowing who he really is underneath the mask. He goes home, gets into bed, and cannot sleep. He lies there in the dark, haunted by what he has done. For the first time in the series, we see Stewie experience genuine guilt. Not a joke, not a cutaway. Real, quiet, painful guilt. That ending is devastating because it shows us exactly how deep the fear goes. Stewie would rather let someone die than risk being known. He would rather carry the weight of that forever than let even one person in the world see the real him. That is not villainy. That is not evil. That is a person who is so afraid of being rejected for who they truly are that they will do anything, to keep the mask in place. And this is where Stewie's story connects to something much bigger than a cartoon. Millions of people, especially young people who are questioning their identity or their sexuality, live inside some version of this same trap. They feel different. They know something about them does not match what the people around them expect. And instead of being able to explore that safely, they build a version of themselves that feels acceptable. They become the class clown, or the overachiever, or the tough kid, or the one who does not care about anything. They construct a personality that protects them from the one question they are most afraid of hearing. Who are you, really? Stewie's entire life is built around avoiding that question. His genius is real, sure, but the way he uses it, to dominate, to control, to stay 10 steps ahead of everyone, is not about intelligence. It is about fear. If he is the smartest person in the room, nobody can look down on him. If he is the most dangerous person in the room, nobody can hurt him. If he is performing a character so elaborate and so complete that nobody can see through it, then nobody can reject the person underneath. And for a 1-year-old baby living in a house where his father barely notices him, His mother is too overwhelmed to truly connect with him, and his siblings are dealing with their own problems. That kind of invisibility makes the mask feel not just useful, but necessary. Think about Stewie's relationship with his parents. Peter calls him the baby, or ignores him entirely. There have been multiple episodes where Peter does not even seem to know Stewie's name. He regularly refers to him as just the kid. Lois tries, but most episodes play on the idea that she cannot fully understand what Stewie is saying. He talks and talks and talks, and she responds to him the way you would respond to a baby babbling.
She does not hear him. Not really. There are moments where the connection breaks through, like in Stewie Loves Lois, where she fixes his beloved Rupert and serves him a meal he likes, and Stewie briefly opens up to loving her. But as soon as he becomes too dependent on her, Lois pulls away, ignoring him on purpose. And just like that, Stewie snaps back to his old ways. The lesson he takes from that experience is brutal and clear. If you let someone in, they will pull away. If you show that you need someone, they will use it against you. Better to not need anyone at all. Is it any wonder he built a fortress around himself? Is it any wonder he created a version of Stewie Griffin that is louder, meaner, smarter, and more British than anyone in Quahog?
The show itself acknowledged how central this need to be different is to Stewie's identity. In the Season 10 episode Viewer Mail 2, there is a sketch where the entire Griffin family is British. Everyone speaks with an English accent, except Stewie. In that version, Stewie speaks like a stereotypical redneck American. The joke is brilliant because it proves the point. Stewie is not actually British. He is just inherently the opposite of whoever is around him. Whatever the rest of his family is, he needs to be something else. He needs to be separate. Because being the same as them, being part of them, would mean being vulnerable in the ways they are vulnerable. And he has watched what vulnerability does to the people in his house. It gets Peter laughed at. It gets Lois taken for granted. It gets Meg destroyed. Stewie looked at all of that and decided, probably before he could even walk, that he would never let it happen to him. When the world does not see you, you make yourself impossible to ignore. And when the world might not accept who you really are, you make sure they never get the chance to find out. The tragedy of Stewie is that he is brilliant enough to understand exactly what he is doing, but not brave enough, not yet, to stop doing it. He saw himself clearly in that therapist's office. He heard his own real voice. He felt the relief of honesty for a few brief minutes, and then he chose the mask again. He chose to remain what he called superior, brilliant, special. He said, "Nobody will ever know the real me." And here is the cruel irony. The one person Stewie is closest to, the one relationship that could potentially give him the safety he needs to take the mask off, is his friendship with Brian. Brian is the only person in the house who consistently hears Stewie, who talks back, who treats him like a real person. And yet, even Brian does not get to see the real Stewie. When Stewie came home after that therapy session, he did not tell Brian what happened. He got into bed and suffered alone. Even with the one person who might understand, the armor stays on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that single line, "Nobody will ever know the real me," might be the saddest thing anyone has ever said on Family Guy. But Stewie is not the only Griffin hiding behind a carefully built version of himself. There is a dog in that house who has spent years constructing a persona of his own, one built on intelligence, sophistication, and moral superiority, and the cracks in that mask are even more visible. That is Brian. Section 6. Brian Griffin, the narcissist who thinks he's the smartest person in the room. Brian Griffin is the family dog. He walks on two legs, drives a Toyota Prius, drinks martinis, smokes occasionally, and has been working on a novel for the better part of a decade. He went to Brown University, although he dropped out one credit short of graduating. He speaks French, he loves opera and jazz, he reads The New Yorker, and he will make absolutely sure you know all of these things within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. In the early seasons of Family Guy,
Brian was the voice of reason. He was the one who sat Peter down and told him his ideas were stupid. He was the calm, collected, intelligent presence in a house full of chaos. He was the character that viewers were supposed to relate to, the one sane person watching the madness unfold and shaking his head. And for a while, that worked. Brian was genuinely likable. He was smart, he was kind, he cared about the people around him even when they drove him crazy. But something happened as the show went on. The mask started slipping, and what was underneath was not the sophisticated, thoughtful, intellectual Brian pretended to be. What was underneath was something a psychologist would find very familiar. A person whose entire identity is built on being smarter than everyone else, who falls apart the moment that identity gets threatened, and who uses other people to prop himself up while offering almost nothing real in return. In simpler terms, Brian Griffin became a textbook example of someone with an overblown ego hiding deep insecurity. Let us start with the writing, because nothing reveals Brian's true nature more clearly than his relationship with his own work. Brian spent years writing his novel faster than the speed of love. He talked about it constantly. He treated it like proof that he was a serious person, an artist, someone who had important things to say. When Stewie would ask him about the novel, Brian would dodge and deflect, but the pride was always there underneath. This book was his identity. It was the thing that separated him from the rest of the family. Peter was an idiot. Chris was a lost cause. Meg was a punchline. But Brian was a writer. Except he was not a very good one. When Faster Than the Speed of Love was finally published in 420, it bombed. Completely. A news broadcast reported that it set a record for the worst-selling novel of all time. Not a single copy sold. Critics called it poorly written and unreadable. And the plot, which Brian had spent years crafting, turned out to be basically a copy of the Iron Eagle movie series, even though Brian swore he had never seen the films. He had spent nearly a decade of his life building this thing, telling himself and everyone around him that he was creating something meaningful, and the finished product was a stolen plot that nobody wanted to read. Now, how a person handles failure tells you everything about who they really are. A healthy person would be hurt, sure. They would grieve the loss, but eventually
They would look at what went wrong, learn from it, and try again with more honesty. That is not what Brian did. In Brian Writes a Bestseller, Brian gets hundreds of boxes shipped back to him containing every unsold copy of his novel. The boxes are packed with shredded pages of his own book. It is the ultimate humiliation. And Brian's response is not to reflect on his craft or get better. His response is to write a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It in a single afternoon, specifically to prove that the public is stupid enough to buy anything. He fills it with 50 blank pages for the reader to write in themselves. He puts no heart into it, no effort, no vulnerability, and it becomes a bestseller. This is where the psychology gets interesting, because what Brian does next is exactly what a deeply insecure person does when they accidentally stumble into success. He becomes an absolute monster. He goes on a book tour. He hires Stewie as his publicist and then treats him like garbage. He becomes arrogant, rude, and dismissive of everyone around him. He starts acting like the genius he always told himself he was, even though the thing making him famous is a book he wrote as a joke. When he appears on a talk show, the host and panelists challenge him on the quality of the book, and Brian crumbles. He admits it is not good. He admits he just wanted something that would sell. The host loses all respect for him and shames him on national television. Brian, humiliated, urinates on the floor, a dog behavior that surfaces whenever his carefully built human persona collapses under pressure. A psychologist watching this would see the pattern immediately. Brian does not actually want to be a great writer. He wants to be seen as one. He does not care about the work itself. He cares about what the work says about him. And the moment the gap between his self-image and reality becomes too obvious to ignore, he either lashes out at other people or collapses entirely. This is the core of what drives people who build their identity around being the smartest person in the room. It is not about intelligence. It is about the fear that without that label, they are nothing. And this fear shows up in every single part of Brian's life. Look at his relationships. Brian has a pattern with women that repeats over and over. He pursues women who are younger, often significantly younger than him. He uses his vocabulary, his supposed sophistication, and his image as an intellectual to attract them. But the relationships never last. They fall apart because Brian cannot maintain the act indefinitely. Eventually, the real Brian shows through, the insecure, needy, self-absorbed version, and the other person leaves. His most significant relationship was with Jess, a woman diagnosed with terminal cancer, whom Brian married. When she was dying, he was devoted. When she recovered and was going to live, Brian fell apart. He became overweight, emotionally distant, and miserable. Because the dynamic had changed. He was no longer the noble partner standing by a dying woman. He was just a regular husband in a regular marriage, and that was not a role he knew how to play. And when they do leave, Brian never looks at himself. He blames them. He blames circumstances. He blames the universe. The one thing he never does is ask what he might be doing wrong. In Play It Again, Brian, he wins an award for an essay, and then it comes out that he plagiarized it. He did not even write the thing that earned him recognition. In Brian Goes Back to College, he gets invited to write for The New Yorker, one of the most respected publications in the country. But he dropped out of Brown University and was 1 credit short of a degree. When he goes back to finish, he is completely out of his depth. The intelligence he claims to have does not match the actual requirements of the work. He has been coasting on the image of being smart without doing the hard, unglamorous work that actual intelligence requires. And then there is his relationship with the rest of the family. Brian positions himself as morally superior to Peter, Lois, Chris, and Meg. He acts like he is above them, but when you actually look at his behavior, he is no better. He is an alcoholic who drinks daily and has shown withdrawal symptoms when forced to stop. He has used cocaine, developing a full addiction after a stint as a drug-sniffing dog that led him to rehab. He smokes marijuana regularly. He has been irresponsible, reckless, and selfish in ways that rival Peter at his worst. He once tried to sleep with Lois, his best friend's wife. He has hit on other people's girlfriends repeatedly. The difference is that Peter does not pretend to be anything other than what he is. Peter is dumb and he knows it. Brian is just as flawed, but dresses it up in a vocabulary that makes it look different. He wraps his selfishness in the language of philosophy and his cowardice in the language of sophistication, and somehow convinces himself that the wrapping changes what is inside. Nobody calls Brian out on this more directly than Quagmire. In the episode, Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire sits Brian down and tells him, in detail, exactly why he cannot stand him. He tells Brian that he is pretentious, that he is a bad writer, that he constantly hits on other people's girlfriends, that he acts like he is better than everyone when he has accomplished almost nothing in his life, that he is all talk and no substance. He tells Brian that he bores everyone he meets and that nobody has the guts to say it to his face. It is one of the most brutal speeches in the history of the show, and the reason it hits so hard is that every single word of it is true. Brian has no real defense. He just sits there and takes it, because deep down, he knows. And what is even more telling is what Brian does after that conversation. He does not change. He does not reflect. He does not go home and take a hard look in the mirror. He goes right back to being the same Brian. Because changing would mean admitting that the person he has been pretending to be was never real. And that admission is the one thing he cannot afford to make. And that is the thing about Brian that makes him psychologically fascinating rather than just annoying. He knows. On some level, buried under all the posturing and the martinis and the Prius and the half-finished manuscripts, Brian knows that he is performing. He knows the image does not match the reality. And that knowledge, that secret awareness that he is a fraud, is what makes him so desperate to maintain the act. Because if he stops performing, if he drops the intellectual mask even for a second, he has to face the thing he is most afraid of. He is a dog. An abandoned dog at that. Peter found him on the side of a highway. Before the Griffins took him in, he was homeless, hungry, and alone. His father was, by Brian's own account, a racist. His mother was a normal dog. He came from nothing, and everything he has built since then, the accent, the vocabulary, the taste in music, the college education he did not finish. All of it is an attempt to put as much distance as possible between who he is now and where he came from. This is something psychologists see all the time in people. When someone grows up feeling fundamentally less than, whether it is because of poverty, abandonment, social status, or any other kind of early wound, they will sometimes build an entire personality around being the opposite of what they were. They become the most cultured person in the room, the most well-read, the most articulate, not because they genuinely love those things, although they might, but because those things serve as proof that they are no longer the broken, rejected version of themselves. The problem is, the broken version never actually goes away, it just hides. And every failure, every rejection, every moment where the cracks show, sends them spiraling, because it threatens to expose the thing they have spent their whole life running from. Brian's relationship with Stewie is the one place where this armor occasionally drops. In Brian and Stewie, an episode that takes place entirely inside a bank vault where the two of them are accidentally locked in overnight, Brian admits that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box. He has it because he has thought about ending his life. He tells Stewie that he carries it as an option, just in case things get bad enough. He tells him that some days he wakes up and does not know why he bothers. It is the most honest, most vulnerable Brian has ever been, and it only happens because he is trapped in a room with the one person who he trusts enough to be real with. There is nowhere to run. There is no book tour to distract him, no martini to hide behind, no clever comment to deflect with. It is just him and Stewie and the truth. That moment tells us that behind all the ego, behind the failed novels and the pretentious opinions and the endless need to be the smartest person at the table, Brian is a deeply unhappy person. He is lonely. He is lost. He does not know who he actually is underneath the performance. And instead of doing the hard work of figuring that out, he keeps adding layers to the character he plays, hoping that if the disguise is convincing enough, he will eventually convince himself. Brian Griffin is not a bad person at his core. He is a scared one. He is someone who was thrown away, who clawed his way into a family and a life, and who built an identity out of everything he thought would make people respect him. And the tragedy is that none of it works. The family tolerates him, but rarely takes him seriously. His books fail, his relationships crumble, and the one person who actually sees through all of it, Stewie, is a 1-year-old who is dealing with his own identity crisis. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But if Brian and Stewie are both hiding behind carefully built versions of themselves, the question becomes, what happens when you put two people like that together? What kind of relationship do you get when both people are wearing masks? And that is exactly what we need to look at next. Not Brian alone, and not Stewie alone, but the two other characters together, and what their bond tells us about attachment, loneliness, and the relationships we cling to when we have nowhere else to go. Section 7. Peter and Lois. A psychological breakdown of a codependent marriage. By now, we have looked at Peter and Lois separately. We have seen Peter's arrested development, his childhood abuse, his inability to grow up. We have seen Lois's wealthy but emotionally cold upbringing, her pattern of caretaking, and the slow erosion of who she is under the weight of managing everyone else. But to really understand what is happening inside the Griffin household, you have to look at these two as a unit. Because what Peter and Lois have is not just a marriage, it is a system. And that system, from a psychological perspective, is one of the clearest examples of a codependent relationship you will ever see on television. A codependent relationship is not about two people who love each other and depend on each other in normal, healthy ways. It is about two people who need each other's problems to function. One person plays the role of the mess, the one who breaks things, who creates chaos, who needs constant managing. The other plays the role of the fixer, the one who cleans up, who holds things together, who sacrifices their own needs to keep the ship from sinking. And the key feature of codependency is that neither person can stop. The mess cannot stop making messes because that is the only way they know how to get attention and feel alive. And the fixer cannot stop fixing because that is the only way they know how to feel valuable and needed. They are locked together in a cycle that feeds on itself,
and the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to break. Neither person chose this pattern on purpose. They fell into it because it is what their childhoods trained them for. That is Peter and Lois in a single paragraph. Think about how they met. Peter was a towel boy working for Lois's aunt. He had no money, no education, no social standing. Lois was a Pewterschmidt, born into billions. Her father Carter tried everything to keep them apart. He knocked Peter unconscious. He shipped him away. He offered Peter money to disappear. But Peter refused the bribe, and Lois chose him anyway. They eloped, with Lois already pregnant with Meg. On the surface, this is a story about love winning out over money and class. But underneath it, something else was happening. Lois was choosing the exact person who would need her the most. A man with nothing, from nowhere, who could barely take care of himself. Peter was not a partner she chose because he would challenge her or grow alongside her. He was a project. The only way anyone in his household noticed he existed. And Lois absorbs the chaos because absorbing other people's problems is the only way she knows how to feel like she matters. They are not staying together despite the dysfunction. They are staying together because of it. The dysfunction is the glue. Without it, neither one of them would know what to do with themselves. And here is where it gets even more complicated. Lois is not just a passive victim in this dynamic. As the show goes on, we see that she has her own patterns of destructive behavior that are just as damaging as Peter's. In Bill and Peter's bogus journey, she sleeps with Bill Clinton while Peter is downstairs. In Big Man on Hippocampus, after Peter loses his memory and does not recognize her, she leaves him and ends up in Quagmire's bed within a day. In Lethal Weapons, after learning martial arts, she becomes drunk with power and physically abuses Peter, using her new black belt in taijutsu to dominate the household. When Peter finally hits her back, she immediately plays the victim, even though she started it. In The Perfect Castaway, when Peter is shipwrecked and presumed dead, she marries Brian, the family dog, and when Peter returns, she manipulates the situation so that Brian feels guilty enough to step aside. She even told Brian afterward, in the most patronizing way possible, that she was a day away from actually sleeping with him. And in Peter Passment, when Peter comes to her saying his female boss has been sexually harassing him at work, Lois tells him flatly that a woman cannot sexually harass a man. She dismisses his experience entirely. None of this is the behavior of a woman who is simply trapped in a bad marriage. This is someone who has her own deep issues with control, impulsiveness, and the need for validation. And the marriage accommodates all of it. Because that is what codependent relationships do. They do not just allow bad behavior from one person. They create a space where both people can act out their worst impulses, because the other person's problems always seem bigger. Peter can point to Lois being controlling and say, "See, she is the problem." And Lois can point to Peter being reckless and say, "See? He is the reason I have to be this way." They each use the other person's dysfunction as an excuse for their own, and the cycle never breaks. The children are the ones who pay the price. We have already talked about what happens to Meg, Chris, and Stewie in this household. But it is important to understand that the damage those kids carry is not just because Peter is a bad father or Lois is an overwhelmed mother. It is because the marriage itself is a black hole that sucks up all the available energy in the house. Peter and Lois are so locked into their cycle of chaos and cleanup, creation and repair, that there is almost nothing left over for the kids. The emotional budget of this family is spent entirely on the marriage. Whatever is left over, which is almost nothing, trickles down to the children. Meg gets scapegoated because the parents need somewhere to dump the tension that builds between them. When Peter and Lois are angry at each other, but cannot express it directly, that anger has to go somewhere. It goes to Meg. Chris gets ignored because he does not generate enough drama to register on their radar. He is the quiet one, the easy one, the one they assume is fine because he has not set anything on fire this week. And Stewie retreats into his own world because the emotional environment of the house offers him nothing to connect to. He builds time machines and talks to the dog because the two adults who are supposed to be raising him are too consumed by each other to notice him. In The Candidate, the show reveals that Lois forced Peter into having sex to conceive their children. Meg, Chris, and Stewie were not the products of mutual desire. They were the result of Lois needing something to fill the emptiness inside her, needing a purpose, needing to feel like her existence was justified through motherhood. Peter did not want more children. He cried and begged her to stop. But Lois's need was bigger than his consent, bigger than his feelings, bigger than anything. That revelation changes the way you look at the entire family. These children were not brought into the world because two people loved each other and wanted a family. They were brought into the world because one person in the marriage needed them to exist in order to feel whole. And the other person in the marriage was too powerless, too beaten down, too conditioned to say no. That is codependency at its most extreme. It is not just about who does the dishes or who makes the decisions. It is about one person's unmet emotional needs overriding another person's basic boundaries. It is about the caretaker becoming the controller. It is about the childlike partner becoming so dependent that they cannot even protect themselves from the person who is supposed to love them most. And yet, somehow, Peter and Lois stay together, through everything. Through the injuries, the infidelity, the financial disasters, the neglected children, the lies, and the constant cycle of breaking and repairing. They stay. And a psychologist would say that this is not because they love each other too much to leave. It is because they are too afraid of what they would be without each other. Peter without Lois is a man with no structure, no anchor, no one to manage the chaos he cannot manage himself. Lois without Peter is a woman with no purpose, no one to fix, no role to play. They have each built their entire identity around the other person's problems, and dismantling that would mean facing themselves, alone, with no distractions. For two people who have spent their entire lives running from their own pain, that is the scariest possibility there is. The marriage of Peter and Lois Griffin is not a love story. It is a survival pact. Two broken people clinging to each other because the alternative is standing on their own, and neither of them has ever learned how to do that. They tried being apart. In The Perfect Castaway, they were physically separated for months. In Big Man on Hippocampus, Peter forgot Lois existed entirely. And every single time, they found their way back. Not because they worked on themselves, not because they grew, but because the pull of the cycle was stronger than anything else in their lives. And the saddest part is that the people who suffer most from this arrangement are not Peter and Lois. They have each other. They have the cycle. It keeps them busy. It gives them something to do. The people who suffer are the three kids upstairs who never asked to be born into this, who were brought into the world to serve someone else's emotional needs, and who are growing up in a house where the loudest lesson being taught every single day is that love and chaos are the same thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But how did this parenting style actually shape those children? What happens when neglect and inconsistency are not just occasional slip-ups, but the entire foundation a kid grows up on?
That is what we are going to look at next. Section 8. The Griffin Parenting Style. How Neglect Became Normal. In the last section, we talked about how Peter and Lois are trapped in a codependent marriage, a cycle where chaos and cleanup eat up all the emotional energy in the house. But a marriage does not exist in a vacuum. There are 3 children living under that roof, and the way Peter and Lois parent those children is not just bad. It is a blueprint for how damage gets passed down from one generation to the next. To understand what is happening inside the Griffin household, you first need to understand something about parenting itself. There are basically 4 ways parents tend to raise their kids. Some parents set clear rules and also show warmth and love. They explain why the rules exist. They listen to their kids. They hold boundaries, but they also hold their children close. That is the healthiest approach. Then there are parents who are strict but cold. All rules, no warmth. Do what I say or else. Then there are parents who are all warmth and no rules. They let their kids do whatever they want because saying no feels too hard. And then there is the 4th kind, the kind where there are no real rules and no real warmth either. The kids are just sort of there, floating. Nobody is steering the ship. Nobody is watching the road. Peter and Lois Griffin are that 4th kind of parent, and the show proves it over and over again across hundreds of episodes. Start with the basics. How were these children even brought into the world? In A Fish Out of Water, Lois tells Meg directly, during an awkward car ride, that she was on birth control when she got pregnant. The medication failed because she was taking antibiotics at the same time. Meg was not planned. She was an accident. In A Mission Impossible, we learn that Chris was the result of a broken condom. The Griffins actually sued over the faulty product, and the settlement money is what paid for their house. Chris was not planned either. His existence was a lawsuit. And then there is Stewie. In The Candidate, it is revealed that Lois forced Peter to conceive all 3 children against his will, with Peter crying and begging her to stop. In Peter's Daughter, Lois actually teaches Meg how to cause a miscarriage. The same woman who forced her husband into having children is now casually coaching her teenage daughter on how to end a pregnancy. This is not a woman who wanted to be a mother because she loved the idea of raising children. This is a woman who needed children to fill a role in her life and then did not know what to do with them once they arrived. And Peter is no better. In The Courtship of Stewie's Father, Stewie's preschool teacher tells Lois that Stewie has been drawing pictures of killing his mother. Instead of being alarmed at what the drawings mean about her son's emotional state, Lois's main concern is that Peter is not in any of the pictures. Her takeaway is not, "My child might be struggling." It is, "My husband is not involved enough." And when Peter does try to bond with Stewie, the only thing that works is hurting Lois together. They prank her. They drop her car into a lake with her inside. Peter and Stewie bond by teaming up against the one person who is supposed to hold the family together. And when Lois finally puts her foot down and tells them to stop, Peter sides with Lois and sends Stewie to his room. Stewie feels betrayed. The one time his father paid attention to him, it was built on cruelty toward his mother. And the moment it stopped being fun for the adults, the kid got shut out. That is the pattern. The children only get attention when something goes wrong, when something breaks, or when Peter needs entertainment. Outside of those moments, the kids are furniture. They exist in the background. They eat at the table, they sit on the couch, and nobody asks them how they feel about anything. Look at how Peter talks about his own children. When Lois tells him they need to discuss their son, Peter responds by asking which one, the fat one or the funny-looking one. He does not use their names. He identifies them by their flaws. Chris is the fat one. Stewie is the funny-looking one. And Meg barely registers at all. Peter calls her "Shut up, Meg" so often that it has become one of the most quoted lines in the entire show. He has shot her, farted on her face, sold her to pay a pharmacy bill and 8 simple rules for buying my teenage daughter, and once opened fire on her at the dinner table. In Jungle Love, when Lois drops Chris off for his first day of high school and reassures him it will be fine, she then honks the horn and screams, "Freshman!" out the window, instantly making him a target for every older kid in the building. Peter calls Stewie the baby instead of using his name. He frequently forgets basic facts about all 3 children. These are not jokes that exist outside the story.
They are part of who Peter and Lois are as parents. They do not see their kids as people. They see them as background noise that sometimes gets in the way of whatever they want to do next. But Lois is not the rescuer here either. That is what makes the Griffin household so damaging. In most families where one parent is neglectful or harmful, the other parent steps in. They become the safe one, the one the kids can count on. Lois does not do this. She fails each child in her own specific way. With Meg, it is cruelty wearing a thin mask of indifference. In Peter's daughter, Meg tells Lois she loves her, and Lois does not respond. Just silence. In Steroids, when Meg is upset about not being invited to a party,
Lois hands her some pills, and a book by a famous author who killed herself says, "Whatever happens, happens," and walks out of the room. She is not parenting. She is checking out. She is telling her daughter in the clearest possible way that her pain is not worth sticking around for. And at one point, Lois even coaches Meg on how to cause a miscarriage in Peter's daughter. A mother, teaching her teenage daughter how to end a pregnancy. That is not guidance. That is someone who never processed her own feelings about motherhood, dumping those feelings onto her child. With Chris, Lois barely shows up at all. When Chris is expelled from school in No Chris Left Behind for being the lowest scoring student, Lois lets Peter handle the situation. Peter's solution is to try to get Chris into a fancy private school, which falls apart. Nobody sits down with Chris to figure out why he is struggling. Nobody gets him tested. Nobody hires a tutor. He is just moved from one place to another, like a piece of furniture that does not quite fit anywhere. When Chris shows talent in art, Lois does not encourage it. When a New York art dealer offers to represent Chris's work in "A Picture is Worth $1,000," the opportunity falls apart, and nobody follows up. The message Chris gets from both parents is simple: you are not worth the effort. With Stewie, the failure is different, but just as deep. Stewie is a baby who talks, builds weapons, has traveled through time, and has tried to kill his mother on multiple occasions. And neither Peter nor Lois seems to hear him. Peter calls him the baby. Lois responds to babbling, not to the words Stewie is actually saying. In Send in Stewie, Please, when Stewie has his breakthrough therapy session, neither parent knows it happened. Neither parent would have sent him to therapy in the first place. The school arranged it. And when Stewie comes home from that session, carrying the weight of having just killed his therapist to protect his deepest secret, he walks back into a house where nobody notices anything has changed, because nobody was watching in the first place. The result of all this is 3 children growing up in the same house, but each experiencing a completely different kind of damage. Meg learns that she is worthless and that her pain does not matter. Chris learns that he is invisible and that nobody will fight for him. Stewie learns that the only safe person to be is a fake version of himself, because the real version will never be seen by the people who are supposed to see him first. And here is the part that makes all of this worse. Peter and Lois are not bad people in the way a villain in a movie is bad. They are not scheming to hurt their children. They are not sitting around planning how to ruin their kids' lives. They are just repeating what was done to them. Peter grew up with a stepfather who told him he was worthless, who hit him, who called him stupid, and who withheld every kind of warmth a father is supposed to give. Of course, Peter does not know how to be a father. He never had one. Lois grew up with a billionaire father who refused to pay ransom when she was kidnapped, who fired her favorite nanny, and who treated emotional closeness like a weakness. Of course, Lois does not know how to comfort her children. She was never comforted herself. This is what psychologists call the cycle. Pain that is not dealt with does not disappear. It gets handed down. A child who is neglected grows up and has children of their own, and because they never learned what healthy attention looks like, they neglect their kids in new ways. A child who was controlled grows up and either becomes controlling or becomes so afraid of control that they let everything slide. Either way, the damage travels. It moves through families like water moving through cracks in a wall. You might not see it for years, but it is always working its way down. Peter and Lois did not choose to be bad parents, but they also never chose to be better ones. They never went to therapy.
They never sat down and talked about how their childhoods affected them. They never looked at their own behavior and asked whether they were repeating old patterns. And so the patterns continued. Meg became the punching bag because somebody always had to be the punching bag in their house, just like Peter was the punching bag in his. Chris became invisible because there was only room for one problem at a time, and he was never loud enough to be that problem. And Stewie built a wall of fake accents and world domination plans because showing who he really was felt too dangerous in a house where nobody was safe enough to catch him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here is the question that this section leads to. Meg is not just a character in a show. The role she plays inside this family, the scapegoat, the lightning rod, the one who absorbs everyone else's problems so the rest of the system can function, that role exists in real families too, millions of them. So, what does psychology actually say about why families create a Meg? Why does every broken family seem to pick one person to carry the weight for everyone else? That is where we are headed next. Section 9. Why every family has a Meg. The psychology of scapegoating. At the end of the last section, we asked a question. Why do broken families always seem to pick one person to carry the weight for everyone else? Why does someone always end up being the punching bag? In the Griffin house, that person is Meg. But Meg is not just a cartoon character. She is a mirror. And what she reflects back is something that happens in real families, in real homes, in real living rooms, every single day. The word scapegoat comes from an ancient practice. A community would take a goat and symbolically load it with all the sins and failures of the group. Then, they would send the goat out into the wilderness. The animal would carry the weight of everything the community could not face about itself. The goat did nothing wrong. It was chosen because someone had to be chosen. The point was never about the goat. The point was that the group needed somewhere to put its guilt so it could keep going without changing. That is exactly what happens to Meg Griffin, and it is exactly what happens to the scapegoat in real families. In Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg finally has enough. She stands up and tells her family the truth. She tells Peter he is a terrible father. She tells Lois she is a bad mother. She tells Chris he is cruel to her. And for a moment, the Griffins are stunned. They have never heard Meg say these things out loud. But then something strange happens. Instead of listening, instead of reflecting, instead of changing, the family turns on each other. Peter and Lois start fighting. Chris lashes out. The house falls apart. Without Meg absorbing everyone's anger and frustration, the family has nowhere to put it. They start dumping it on each other instead. The entire system breaks down. And then comes the most heartbreaking moment in the entire series. Meg sees what is happening and makes a choice. She goes back to being the punching bag. She apologizes. She tells Brian that every family needs a lightning rod, someone who absorbs all the dysfunction so the rest of them do not destroy each other. She volunteers to be that person again. Not because she believes she deserves it, but because she has been trained to believe that this is her purpose. A psychologist watching that scene would recognize it immediately. What Meg describes is one of the most well-studied patterns in family psychology. It even has a name: the identified patient. In a broken family, the identified patient is the person everyone points to and says, "That is the problem." If it were not for them, the family would be fine. If they would just behave differently, everything would be okay. But the truth, the part nobody in the family wants to admit, is that the identified patient is not the problem. They are the symptom. They are the place where the family's real problems show up because nobody else is willing to let those problems show up in them. The family uses them like a trash can for feelings. Every time someone in the family feels ashamed, angry, guilty, or scared, instead of sitting with that feeling and asking where it comes from, they throw it at the scapegoat. And the scapegoat catches it. Every single time. Because that is what they have been taught to do since they were small enough to carry it. Think about it this way. Imagine a pipe that is leaking inside a wall. You cannot see the leak, but water starts pooling on the floor in one corner of the room. You could mop up that corner every day and blame the floor for being wet. Or you could open the wall and fix the pipe. The scapegoat is the wet floor. The family keeps mopping and blaming, but the pipe behind the wall never gets touched. In the Griffin house, the pipe is the marriage. Peter and Lois are locked in a codependent cycle of chaos and cleanup.
They create tension constantly. Peter does something reckless. Lois gets angry. The house fills with stress. But instead of dealing with their own conflict directly, they need somewhere for that stress to go. It goes to Meg. Peter mocks her. Lois ignores her. And for a brief moment, the tension between Peter and Lois is relieved because they have found a common target. Picking on Meg is one of the only things they do together without fighting. It is the one activity that unites the whole family. And that is the terrifying part. Scapegoating works. It actually holds the family together, at least on the surface. As long as there is one person everyone can agree is the problem, the rest of the family does not have to look at itself. Peter does not have to face the fact that he is mentally disabled and emotionally stuck at age 12. Lois does not have to face the fact that she never wanted children and has been running from that truth for 20 years. Chris does not have to face the fact that he has a learning difficulty nobody ever addressed. And Stewie does not have to face the fact that he is hiding his real self behind a fake accent and a wall of weapons. As long as Meg is the problem, nobody else has to be. But why Meg? Why her and not Chris or Stewie? This is where real psychology gets really specific. Research shows that the child most likely to become the scapegoat is usually the one who is the most emotionally aware. They are the one who sees the cracks in the family before anyone else does. They are the truth teller, the one who says out loud what everyone else is thinking but nobody wants to admit. And because they tell the truth, the family pushes them away. Because the truth threatens the whole system. Meg fits this perfectly. She is the one who tells Peter he is a bad father. She is the one who tells Lois she is a bad mother. She is the one who sees the family clearly for what it is. And the family punishes her for it. Not because she is wrong, but because being right is dangerous. If the family admits Meg is right, then they have to admit they are all broken. And they are not ready for that. There is another reason Meg was chosen, and it has nothing to do with her personality. It has to do with how she came into the world. In A Fish Out of Water, Lois tells Meg directly that she was an accident, that her birth control failed because of antibiotics. Meg was conceived before Peter and Lois were even married. She is the reason they eloped. From the very beginning, Meg's existence was framed as a mistake. She was not wanted. She was not planned. And on some level, whether they realize it or not, Peter and Lois have been punishing her for that ever since. Not because she did anything wrong, but because her very existence is a reminder of a life they did not choose. She is the living proof that this family was built on an accident. And every time they look at her, some small part of them remembers that. The damage this causes is enormous, and the show does not shy away from showing it. In Steroids, Meg shows Connie D'Amico the scars on her arms, each one connected to a specific humiliation. That is not a throwaway joke. That is a teenager whose pain has become so big and so ignored that she has turned it inward on her own body. In Barely Legal and The Kiss Scene Around the World, Meg makes statements about not wanting to be alive. Nobody reacts. Nobody pulls her aside. Nobody calls anyone. The family hears these things and keeps eating dinner. In Dial Meg for Murder, after being sent to prison, she comes back violent and aggressive, beating Peter and robbing a pharmacy while saying nobody cares about her. She had to go to prison and come back broken in a different way before anyone even noticed something was wrong. And even then, the family did not respond with help. They responded with fear. Because in this house, Meg's pain is wallpaper. It has been there so long that nobody sees it anymore. And this is where the cartoon stops being a cartoon. Because this happens in real life all the time. Therapists who work with families will tell you that the scapegoated child almost always shows the most severe symptoms: depression, anxiety, self-harm, trouble in school, trouble with relationships.
And when the family brings that child to therapy, they bring them as the identified patient, the one who needs fixing. But any good therapist knows that you cannot fix the scapegoat without fixing the family. Because the scapegoat did not break themselves, the family broke them. And here is the part that keeps therapists up at night. If the scapegoat leaves, if they move out, cut contact, or refuse to play the role anymore, the family does not suddenly heal. It picks a new scapegoat. Someone else has to fill the role, because the system needs one. It cannot function without someone to absorb the blame.
Researchers studying family systems found that when the scapegoated member got better, another family member would start showing the exact same symptoms, sometimes even the same behaviors. The dysfunction did not disappear when the scapegoat did. It just moved. That is what Seahorse Seashell Party showed in 22 minutes. Meg stops being the scapegoat, and the family immediately starts tearing itself apart. The system collapses without its pressure valve. And Meg, seeing this, walks back into the fire. She chooses suffering over watching her family destroy each other. That is not weakness. That is the kind of self-sacrifice that only makes sense when you have been trained from birth to believe that your purpose is to carry other people's pain. The saddest part is that Meg could leave. She is a teenager. In a few years, she could go to college, get a job, move to another state. But psychology tells us that scapegoats who grow up in this kind of environment often do not leave, at least not easily. They have been conditioned to believe that they are the problem, so they keep trying to fix themselves instead of recognizing that the system is what needs fixing. They stay in bad relationships. They accept jobs where they are treated poorly. They attract friendships that mirror the dynamic they grew up in. The pattern follows them because it is the only pattern they know. Meg Griffin is a cartoon character on a comedy show, but the role she plays is real. There are millions of Megs in the world right now, in houses where they are blamed for everything, where their pain is ignored, where their truth is punished, and where they have come to believe that their only value is in how much they can absorb so that everyone else gets to feel okay. The difference between Meg and a real person in this situation is that Meg resets at the end of every episode. A real scapegoat carries those scars forever. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Meg is not the only Griffin trapped in a painful role they did not choose. There is another relationship in this family that runs on loneliness, on masks, and on two broken souls clinging to each other because nobody else will have them. Brian and Stewie. And what happens between them might be the most emotionally honest thing the show has ever done. Section 10. Brian and Stewie. Attachment and loneliness. In the last section, we talked about Meg carrying the weight of the entire family on her back. But there is another relationship in this house that carries a different kind of weight. Not the weight of blame, the weight of loneliness. And that relationship is between Brian and Stewie, a dog and a baby who somehow became the most emotionally honest pairing in a show built almost entirely on jokes. On the surface, Brian and Stewie should not work as a pair. Brian is an adult, an alcoholic, a failed writer with a fake sense of superiority and a loaded gun hidden in a bank vault. Stewie is a baby, a genius hiding behind a fake British accent, someone who has tried to kill his mother and build weapons of mass destruction, all while secretly being terrified that no one will ever see who he really is. One is performing confidence he does not have. The other is performing evil he does not feel. And yet, when these two are together, something shifts. The masks come off. Not all the way, but more than they come off with anyone else. The show has built an entire series of episodes around this bond. The Road to episodes send Brian and Stewie on adventures together, from Road to Rhode Island, to Road to the Multiverse, to Road to Germany, where they end up fighting through World War II with Mort Goldman. These episodes are fan favorites not because of the action or the jokes, but because of what happens between Brian and Stewie when the world gets dangerous. They protect each other. They argue, but they never leave. They annoy each other constantly, but when it matters,
they show up. It is the only relationship in the entire Griffin household where both people are seen for something close to who they actually are. But the episode that matters most, the one that strips everything else away, is Brian and Stewie. Season 8, Episode 17, the 151st episode of the series. And it is unlike anything Family Guy has ever done before or since. There are no cutaway gags, no music, no other characters, just Brian and Stewie, locked inside a bank vault for an entire weekend, with nowhere to go and nothing to hide behind. For 27 minutes, these two sit in a small room and talk. And what comes out of that conversation changes the way you see both of them forever. It starts ugly. Stewie soils his diaper. Brian refuses to help. They fight over a gun that Brian has stored in his deposit box. Stewie grabs the weapon and threatens Brian with it. The gun goes off by accident and the bullet bounces around the vault walls while they hide under a table. It is chaos. It is messy. And it is exactly how their relationship has always worked. They push, they pull, they clash, and they keep going. But then the episode shifts. The morning comes, they share energy bars, and Stewie asks the question that the whole episode has been building toward. Why does Brian have a gun in his bank vault? Brian tries to dodge it. He says Stewie would not understand. He says it is nothing. But Stewie pushes, and finally, Brian admits the truth. The gun is there in case he ever wants to kill himself. The bottle of scotch next to it is for his last drink. He tells Stewie that life is too much, that he has no purpose, that Stewie was right when he once said Brian does not live with any real meaning. The gun gives him comfort, not because he wants to die today, but because knowing the option exists makes the rest of it feel bearable. This is a comedy show, a cartoon about a fat guy and his talking dog. And here is one of its main characters sitting on the floor of a bank vault, admitting that the only thing keeping him going some days is the knowledge that he has a way out. Stewie's reaction is just as important. He does not make a joke. He does not change the subject. For one of the only times in the entire series, Stewie drops every layer of performance and says something completely real. He tells Brian that Brian is his only friend, that without Brian, he would have nobody, that Brian gives his life purpose. And then he asks Brian to read to him. Brian picks up a book. He reads to Stewie like a parent reads to a child. Stewie falls asleep, and when the vault opens the next morning, Brian picks Stewie up and carries him out. No punchline, no cutaway, no reset. Just two lonely souls who, for one weekend, told each other the truth. A psychologist would look at Brian and Stewie and see something very specific. They are each other's safe person. Not a safe person in the way a therapist is safe or a healthy parent is safe. A safe person in the way that two survivors of the same wreck are safe with each other. They understand the water because they are both drowning in it. Brian has nobody else. His relationships with women fall apart because he performs a version of himself that cannot be maintained. His friendship with Peter is shallow. He then kills the therapist to protect the secret. He goes home. Nobody notices anything has changed. The only person who gets even a glimpse of the real Stewie is Brian. And the only person who gets to see Brian without the pretension and the fake intellectual posture is Stewie. They are mirrors for each other. Not perfect mirrors. Brian still lies, Stewie still manipulates. But they lie and manipulate less with each other than they do with anyone else. And in a house where honesty is treated like a crime, That small amount of truth is everything. This is why Life of Brian hits so hard. In that episode, Brian is struck by a car and killed. Stewie, who had just destroyed his own time machine after a close call with danger, cannot go back and save him. Brian dies on a veterinarian's table while the family stands around him.
Stewie holds his paw. Brian's last words are telling the family he loves them. And then, he is gone. And Stewie falls apart. Not dramatically, not with a big speech. He just goes quiet. The loudest character on the show becomes silent. Because the one person who made him feel real is gone. The family gets a new dog named Vinny. Life moves forward. But Stewie does not recover. He does not bounce back. He does not build a new time machine and laugh about it. He walks through the house like a ghost, barely speaking, barely present. And in Christmas Guy, when Stewie spots a past version of himself at the Quahog Mall carrying a time travel return pad, he steals it and goes back to save Brian. He pushes Brian out of the way of the car. Brian lives, and Stewie hugs him. That is not a comedy beat.
That is a child saving the only person who ever made him feel less alone. The relationship between Brian and Stewie is the emotional core of Family Guy. It is the one thing the show has that no amount of cutaway gags or gross-out humor can replace. And the reason it works is because both characters are broken in ways that fit together. Brian needs someone who sees through his act and stays anyway. Stewie needs someone who hears his real voice, even when he is pretending to use a different one. They are not healing each other. That is important to understand. Neither one of them is getting better because of the other, but they are keeping each other alive. And in a family where nobody else is watching, where the parents are locked in their own cycle, and the other kids are too damaged to reach out, keeping each other alive might be the best either of them can do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But what happens when you zoom out? What happens when you stop looking at individual characters and individual relationships and start looking at the Griffin family as a single living system, a machine where every part affects every other part? That is where we are going next. And what you see when you look at the Griffins that way might be the most disturbing part of this whole essay. Section 11. The Griffins as a family system. How every piece keeps the machine running. Up until now, we have looked at each member of the Griffin family one at a time. Peter the man-child, Lois the enabler, Meg the scapegoat, Chris the invisible one, Stewie the masked genius, Brian the fake intellectual. We have looked at the marriage, the parenting, and the one honest friendship in the house. But here is the thing about families. They do not work as a collection of separate people. They work as a single machine. Every part is connected to every other part, and if you change one piece, the whole thing shifts. That is what this section is about, not the individuals, the system. Think of the Griffin household like a mobile, one of those hanging decorations you see above a baby's crib. Every piece hangs from the same frame. When one piece moves, all the other pieces move to keep the balance. If you cut one piece off, the whole thing tilts. That is how family systems work. Every person in the family has a role, and those roles exist not because the people chose them, but because the system needs them. The system will fight to keep those roles in place. It will resist change. It will punish anyone who tries to step out of their assigned position. Because if one person changes, everyone else would have to change too. And the family is not ready for that. We already saw this happen in Seahorse Seashell Party. Meg stepped out of her role as the scapegoat. She told the truth, and within minutes, the entire family fell apart. Peter and Lois turned on each other. Chris lashed out. The house filled with chaos that had nowhere to land because the person who usually absorbed it had stopped absorbing it. The system broke down the moment one part refused to do its job. And Meg, seeing this, walked back into her role. Not because she wanted to, because the system pulled her back in. That episode is not just a Family Guy plot. It is a textbook example of how broken family systems maintain themselves. The system does not care about the happiness of its individual members. It cares about one thing: staying the same, keeping the balance, avoiding change at all costs. And every single person in the Griffin house plays a part in keeping that balance, whether they know it or not. Peter's role is the chaos creator. He breaks things. He causes disasters. He gets fired, gets arrested, gets injured, injures others. In Petarded, his reckless behavior pours scalding hot grease on Lois, putting her in a full body cast in the hospital. Child Protective Services takes away Meg, Chris, and Stewie because Peter is declared mentally unfit to parent. The family literally splits apart because of what he did. But then Lois recovers, gets the kids back, and everything resets. Nobody talks about it. Nobody addresses what happened. Nobody changes anything. The system absorbs the crisis and goes back to exactly how it was before. Lois's role is the damage controller. She cleans up after Peter. She smooths things over. She talks to the school when Chris gets expelled. She handles the finances when Peter spends everything. She holds the house together with duct tape and silence. But her role also includes something darker. She is the person who makes sure nobody looks too closely at what is actually happening. When Meg says, "I love you," and gets no response, Lois is not just failing as a mother. She is keeping the system stable by making sure Meg stays small, stays quiet, stays in her place. A Meg who feels loved might start expecting more, and a Meg who expects more might start refusing to be the punching bag. And then the whole mobile tilts. Meg's role is to absorb. She takes in the anger, the frustration, the shame, the guilt that the rest of the family cannot deal with. Every time Peter mocks her, every time Lois ignores her, every time Chris joins in, the system breathes a little easier. The tension drops. The marriage survives another day. The other kids stay in their lanes. Meg is not a person in this system. She is a function. She is the release valve that keeps the pressure from building to the point where the whole thing explodes. Chris's role is to be invisible. He is the one who does not cause problems, does not demand attention, does not challenge anyone. His invisibility is not an accident. It is what the system needs from him. There is only room for one person to create chaos, and that is Peter. There is only room for one person to absorb blame, and that is Meg. Chris fills the gap by being the kid nobody worries about, and the price he pays for that is that nobody notices him. His learning problems go undiagnosed, his art goes unsupported, his feelings go unasked. But the system counts this as a success, because a child who makes no noise is a child who creates no new problems for the family to deal with. Stewie's role is the outsider. He exists on the edge of the family, connected to it but not really part of it. His parents do not hear his words. His siblings barely interact with him. He has built an entire alternate reality for himself, complete with a fake accent, weapons, and time machines, because the actual reality of his family offers him nothing. And the system allows this. A Stewie who is off in his own world is a Stewie who is not demanding anything from parents who have nothing left to give. His isolation is not a failure of the family. From the system's point of view, it is a feature. Brian's role is the witness. He sees everything. He is the one character who can observe the family from the inside without being fully subject to the same rules. He is not a child, so Peter and Lois do not parent him. He is not a spouse, so the marriage dynamics do not apply to him directly. He sits at the kitchen table, drinks his martini, and watches the whole thing happen. And most of the time, he says nothing. Because Brian's deeper role in the system is to make it look okay from the outside, he is the smart one, the reasonable one, the one guests and neighbors would look at and think, well, at least there is one normal person in this house. Brian gives the family a false sense of sanity. And that false sense of sanity is one more thing that keeps anyone from looking too hard at what is really going on. Now here is where it gets really uncomfortable. Every single one of these roles is being played by someone who was damaged before they ever entered the system. Peter was abused by his stepfather. Lois was emotionally starved by her parents. Brian was abandoned on a highway as a puppy. And the children, Meg, Chris, and Stewie, were born into this machine. They did not choose their roles. They were assigned them the moment they arrived. And by the time they were old enough to understand what was happening, the roles had already become part of who they were. This is what makes the Griffin family system so hard to break. It is not being held together by one bad person. It is being held together by everyone at once. Peter cannot stop creating chaos without facing the fact that chaos is all he knows. Lois cannot stop controlling everything without admitting that she needs control to feel alive. Meg cannot stop absorbing blame without watching her family tear itself apart. Chris cannot start demanding attention without disrupting a balance he has spent his entire life maintaining by staying quiet. Stewie cannot take off the mask without risking being seen by people who have never once shown they were safe enough to see him. And Brian cannot stop pretending to be above it all without admitting that he is just as broken as the rest of them. They are all trapped, not by walls or locks or chains, by each other, by the roles they play, by the system that none of them built on purpose, but that all of them maintain every single day just by being who they have been trained to be. The show does not say any of this out loud. It does not need to. It shows it. Every episode, every interaction, every reset at the end of every storyline. The Griffins go through something terrible, and then they go back to the couch, and the TV turns on, and nothing changes. That reset is not lazy writing. It is the most psychologically accurate thing about the entire show, because that is exactly what broken families do. They survive the crisis, they breathe, and they go right back to doing the same thing that caused the crisis in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So what would happen if someone actually tried to help this family? What if a psychologist sat them down and treated them not as 6 individuals, but as one system? What would they say? What would they recommend? And would it even be possible for a family this locked in to find a way out? That is where we finish. Section 12. What would a psychologist recommend? We have spent a long time breaking this family apart, looking at every crack, tracing every wound back to where it started. And now we are at the end. So the question becomes, what would actually help? If you took the Griffin family out of the cartoon and sat them down in a real office with a real therapist, what would that therapist say? What would they recommend? And would any of it work? The first thing a psychologist would do is something the Griffins have never done. They would treat the family as a unit. Not Peter in one room, not Meg in another. All of them, together, in the same space. Because as we talked about in the last section, the Griffin family is a system, and you cannot fix a system by only working on one part. If you send Meg to therapy alone, she might start feeling better about herself. She might start setting boundaries. But the moment she walks back into that house, the system will push her right back into the scapegoat role. Her progress will be crushed by the same machine that damaged her in the first place. The only way to change what is happening to Meg is to change what is happening to everyone. That means the therapist would have to start with Peter and Lois. Not because the children are less important, but because the parents built the system. They are the architects, and until the architects understand what they built, nothing in the house will change. With Peter, the work would start with his childhood. A therapist would need to help Peter understand that the way Francis Griffin raised him, the beatings, the insults, the constant message that he was stupid and worthless, was not normal. It was abuse. Peter has spent his entire adult life acting like a child because nobody ever allowed him to grow up. Francis punished curiosity, emotion, and anything that looked like independence. So Peter stopped trying. He froze at whatever age it became easier to be the class clown than to be a real person. A therapist would help Peter grieve for the childhood he never had, helping him understand that his recklessness and cruelty toward his children is not who he is. It is what he became to survive. The therapist would also have to be honest with Peter about his intellectual limitations. In Petarded, Peter is classified as having an intellectual disability. That is not an excuse for hurting people, but it is a reality that needs to be worked with. Peter would need support in understanding what he can and cannot do as a father. With Lois, the work would go in a different direction. Lois does not need to learn how to be less controlling. She needs to learn why she is controlling in the first place. A therapist would trace her behavior back to Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, parents who gave her everything except the one thing a child actually needs, which is the feeling of being loved for who you are. Carter refused to pay ransom when Lois was kidnapped. He fired a nanny she loved.
He treated emotional closeness like weakness. Lois grew up believing that the only way to matter was to be needed. So she married a man who would always need her. And she had children not because she wanted them, but because they gave her a purpose to fill. A therapist would help Lois separate her identity from her role as caretaker. Who is Lois when she is not cleaning up someone else's mess? That is a question she has never been allowed to ask. And until she asks it, she will keep enabling Peter and keep neglecting her children. For Meg, the recommendations would be both the simplest and the hardest. Meg needs to hear, from a professional who has no stake in the family system, that she is not the problem. She has spent her entire life being told, through words and actions and silence, that she is worthless, ugly, unlovable, and that her pain does not matter. A therapist would help Meg understand that the role she plays in the family, the scapegoat, the lightning rod, was assigned to her. She did not earn it, she did not deserve it, and she does not have to keep carrying it. The hardest part for Meg would be accepting that walking away from the role might mean watching her family struggle. In Seahorse Seashell Party, she tried to leave the role and the family collapsed. A good therapist would help Meg understand that the collapse is not her fault. The family was already broken. She was just the one keeping it hidden. For Chris, the recommendations would focus on two things. First, get him properly tested and diagnosed. Chris has struggled in school his entire life. He was expelled in No Chris Left Behind for having the lowest test scores. He has never been evaluated for learning differences. He has never received extra support. He has simply been written off as dumb by his school, by his peers, and by his own parents. A therapist would push for a full evaluation so that Chris could finally get the help he has always needed. Second, Chris needs encouragement for the things he is good at: his art, his ability to connect with people one-on-one, the way he did with Carl at the movie store. Chris is not stupid, he is unsupported. And there is a massive difference between those two things. For Stewie, the situation is more complicated. In Send In Stewie, Please, Stewie had one real therapy session with Dr. Pritchfield. He revealed his fake accent. He admitted that his entire personality is armor. He showed, for the first time in the entire series, who he really is. And then he killed the therapist. Not out of evil, out of fear. Because the idea of someone knowing the real Stewie felt more dangerous than anything else in his life. A psychologist working with Stewie would need to be incredibly patient. They would need to build trust slowly. They would need to create a space where Stewie could take off the mask without believing that doing so would destroy him. And they would need to help his parents learn how to actually hear him. Not the babbling they think they hear, but the real words, the real feelings, the real child underneath all the performance. For Brian, the work would center on honesty. Brian keeps a loaded gun in a bank vault in case he wants to end his life. He drinks heavily. He has failed at every creative and romantic pursuit he has attempted, and he covers all of it with fake superiority that fools almost nobody. A therapist would help Brian face the truth that Quagmire spelled out in Jerome is the New Black, that he is all talk, that he has accomplished nothing, that he uses big words and borrowed opinions to avoid facing how empty he feels. The difference is that a therapist would not stop at the truth. They would help Brian figure out what to build in its place. Not another mask, something real. And for the family as a whole, the biggest recommendation would be the one none of them want to hear. Stop resetting. Stop pretending that each disaster is separate from the last. Stop treating every crisis like a one-time event that can be cleaned up and forgotten. The Griffins survive everything, but they never learn from anything. Lois recovers from the hospital in Petarded, and the family goes right back to the couch. Peter gets the kids taken away, and then gets them back, and nothing changes. Meg stands up and then sits back down. Stewie opens up and then closes the door. Brian admits he wants to die and then pours another drink. The reset is the disease. It is the thing that keeps this family sick. And the only cure is to stop doing it, to let the consequences land, to sit in the discomfort, to face what is broken and make the painful, terrifying choice to actually fix it.
Of course, the Griffins will never do this. They are cartoon characters. The reset is built into the format of the show. Every episode ends and the next one begins, and nothing carries over. That is how animated sitcoms work.
But that is also why the Griffins matter as a psychological case study. Because the reset is not just a feature of the show, it is a feature of real families too. Real families survive crises and go back to the same patterns. Real parents repeat the same mistakes. Real children carry the same roles year after year, decade after decade, long after they leave the house that assigned those roles in the first place. The Griffins are funny because they are absurd, but they are worth studying because they are familiar. Somewhere in this family, you will recognize something. Maybe it is Peter's inability to grow up. Maybe it is Lois's need to control everything while pretending she is the victim. Maybe it is Meg's willingness to sacrifice herself so everyone else can stay comfortable. Maybe it is Chris's quiet acceptance of being overlooked.
Maybe it is Stewie's fear of being known. Maybe it is Brian's terror of being ordinary. Whatever it is, you have seen it before. In your own family, in a friend's family, in a house down the street where everything looks fine from the outside and nothing is fine on the inside. The Griffins are a mirror, and mirrors do not lie. They just show you what is there and leave it up to you to decide what to do about it.